Thank you all for coming. So we made the big announcement. Now we make even a bigger announcement with even bigger numbers. 1 million is big. Now we up the ante a little bit, and we talk about huge numbers. We talk about huge numbers all the time. We look from the Davos is in the mountains. We from mountains down into the valley, from the clouds onto the earth. And today we look at the earth in terms of energy and populations, energy use, abuse, and population growth. We are 6 billion people in the world, and we are adding 2 to 3 more to come. What makes 1 billion more or less? Who could care less? Well, in Switzerland, it might be not such an issue, but in the world, the infrastructure is under tremendous stress. Big numbers in people require big numbers in energy. And energy after air, food, and water is the most important part of life. Not only for keep us warm and cook the rice, but also to provide jobs via a productive industrial base and a sophisticated logistic network of transportation. All these things need energy. We talk about renewables a lot to reduce not only pollution, but also to reduce energy dependencies from social structures that abuse their commodity wealth to suppress other parts of our societies. However, while renewables are noble and probably correct in cause, it is very difficult to achieve the goal. Unless correct policies are in place, the cause can turn into a disaster. Today, some big numbers. One for the electrification of the world over the next 20 years, and one for moving the people around among our daily lives and goods. Number one, electrification. We require a total investment over the next 20 years globally of $50 trillion only to accommodate the electricity demand in the current growth trajectory of the world. In order to meet the COP21 renewable energy goals, we need an additional $40 trillion in order to switch from carbon to non-carbon electric supply. Who is going to pay $100 trillion over the next 20 years? That is the global GDP of last year. It's huge numbers. The second one is, how do you move 6 billion people around? Today, the number one vehicle is combustion engines, the gas motor, and which pollutes the air, obviously. The cars and trucks require 90 million barrels of oil a day. 90 million barrels of oil. 80% is for cars, moving stuff around, and 20% is for producing plastics predominantly petrochemicals, for goods that we are wearing, that we are sitting on, that provide us a roof, and plastics also for consumer goods and construction materials. Now, to reduce or eliminate the 70 billion barrels for the cars is very complex. Zero carbon emission vehicles are great to look at, but when looking at the actual footprint, things do not look as great as perceived. And so therefore, these big numbers, 100 trillion here, 90 million barrels there, so what to do? Finis origine pendet is the motto of this year's. We have to collaborate together in order to find better solutions to reduce those numbers in order to have a greener future. I would like to welcome the panel which are addressing the various aspects of energy and mobility and how the new digital technology is impacting those sectors. Please welcome, I would like to start with Reza Abari from the ETH. He is the world leader in energy transformation from the ETH in Zurich. He's a top advisor to the world's largest power companies, including ABB. Please welcome Reza. Now, while Reza, you might take a seat. While Reza is focused on the macro perspective, the big numbers, the big energy flows, and the big energy transformation and what encompasses it, and people moving. We have to look, after all, we are individuals. We live in small communities, the most part of the world in smaller communities, 50% urbanization centers. So how can we provide energy for the small communities, the ones who have absolutely nothing? And how can we provide a network that lead these small communities into their own destiny, independence, away from a centralized authority and provision of energy, which leads you a lot to conflict. Please welcome Steve Johans from Chicago, who is the leader in microgrid solutions, going down to the individual households and how to integrate those individual households into the grid and accommodating those owners of these mini electricity power stations that they can monetize their supply if they have excessive, or they can buy from the grid if they need electricity. And doing so by issuing a coin, a watt coin. That is the first token, electricity-based token in the world, actually. We hear more about that. Now, we heard another big number, 90 million barrels of oil. We tend to push it away. It's dirty stuff. It is things we do not like to hear. It's oil, dirty, refining. You have to transport it. It's sometimes also attached to some sort of misuse of power and things like this. Well, if you look outside, I don't see a single Tesla driving here in Davos. There are some, but mostly use the gas engine. If you go on a plane, you fly around with jet fuel. If you sit on, everyone sits on oil, every single one. We talk with a product made out of oil. These are plastics, 20%. If we would not have this reliable and cheap supply of these oils, we would not profit from all the cheap consumer goods that are assembled in different parts of the world. We will not be able to communicate and sit comfortably on the chairs that you are. Wooden chairs are heavy. Please welcome David Cassidy, whose family and himself built the second largest ammonia supplier in the world, supplying the feedstock for the very things that we clothe and sit on and profit from. Thank you, David, for coming. We talked another big number, $100 trillion over the next 20 years in order to accommodate that demand in energy that has to come. It's a huge numbers. The only way to finance that is through the accumulation of funds or savings, which we all make through the pension systems, which is being rechanneled through governments or independent companies in order to build those power plants. $100 trillion is so huge that only in the very sophisticated policies can accommodate these big numbers, and how you can match supply and demand in the capital in order to create a sustainable also return for the pensioners. If this is not going to be done, none of us will touch the money that you paid and saved your entire lives. Please welcome Rayon Chaudhary, who is one of the leading asset managers and from your pension funds, built very successful big pension funds asset management company. This is the most essential part. We talk about private equity, but it's actually the pension funds which contribute about 50% of the global financial markets is pension fund money. Huge numbers in demand, huge numbers in supply. Thank you very much for coming all here. I would like to open up the panel with each individual giving a short introduction, and then also what you do and how you see the digital impact affecting your industry. I would like to start with the money man. Rehan, please, you have a green denominated tie. I mean, I remember that sounds like the US dollar, which is still dominant. From New York, Rehan.
Well, no, thank you very much, and thank you, Kaspar and Murat, for sponsoring the event. Perhaps what we can do is frame out 4 significant trends that will affect the energy sector for the next 15 years. The first one is that the future energy of the world will be based on natural gas, battery technology, as well as renewables. If we do look at natural gas reserves, the US alone has over 200 years worth of natural gas reserves. The top 3 shale gas reserves in the world are Russia, China, and the United States. 2 of those economies, the United States and China, are actually the largest consumers of energy as well. So natural gas will rise and continue to rise and start to disrupt more petroleum-based products. The second area is the decline in battery technology in terms of the cost, as well as the effectiveness of the range. So battery costs have been declining by about 15% per annum. Now, roughly by 2022, 2023, the average electric vehicle will cost the same as an internal combustion engine vehicle. So that will probably match the peak oil demand, actually, around the world as well. But batteries are not only for electric vehicles, but will also be the essential base for microgrids. So if we do look at a third of the world's population does not actually have effective access to electricity. 70% of the diseases within the emerging markets for children are based on unclean water because of the lack of energy to process water properly. So the rise of batteries, or the decline in battery pricing and the rise of batteries as storage is an incredibly key component. That'll affect transportation as well as energy management. The third area is that as we go towards electric vehicles, we start to put a lot more taxation on the grid. The grid in many parts of the world is very old, is aged in the Western world. In the emerging markets, it's not connected properly. So that is going to be another key trend. The fourth trend is one where Steve is actually much more of an expert than I am, is the rise of distributed generation. So when we were talking to different ministers here in Davos, if we look at Central Africa, there are large hydro plants that cost significant amounts of money producing energy, large cables, distribution networks connecting villages throughout Eastern and Southern Africa. Those plans are being shelved because the cost now of microgrids has gotten to the point where it's significantly more attractive. I'll give you an example. If you look at diesel generator sets within India, the cost is anywhere between 35 to 45 rupees per kilowatt hour, depending on where it's located within the country. Solar energy is now dropped down to below 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. So the cost of energy is declining rapidly, and it will create significant opportunities. So rather than take up more airtime, I'd rather hand it over to my colleagues. And later on, perhaps we can see how we can make money through this value chain. We talk a lot about disruption, about how businesses are going away, but I think it will create significant opportunities and wealth creation.
Thank you very much. David.
Well, I'm going to struggle to follow that one. That was a wonderful long introduction. Yeah, just to briefly introduce myself. As Caspian mentioned, I'm involved in the petrochemical industry through methanol and fertilizers. And we manufacture exclusively from natural gas. And I think some of the things that I'm interested in is where policy doesn't really match up with reality. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I believe in technological change. But I think people are underestimating what it's going to require to do some of these great things. So Elon Musk announced he's going to build a car company. Everyone thinks he's brilliant. And then British government says all cars are going to be electrified. And the numbers, when you actually go away and work them out, don't add up. Between a number of countries like the UK and the US who've made policy initiatives, we're expecting electric vehicles to be 37% of the entire market by 2040. So in about 20 years, that means that you're going to have to find the same amount of electrical power that's currently generated in the United States. As we all know, the United States is the largest consumer of electricity in the world, and we're all talking about becoming more efficient and consuming less power, but we've just invented something which everyone thinks is free. It's not. We're going to double just the US demand. So the question is whether policy is really thought all the way through, and whether there isn't lower hanging fruit that can be done to achieve some of the goals on a pathway to a carbon-free or carbon-neutral economy. And just to finish off on that thought, I'm not quite sure why everyone's so obsessed with carbon. We're now looking again with the electrical market in terms of lithium and cobalt. What's the difference between taking carbon out of the ground and taking those things out of the ground? If you see strip mines that are being in Australia and China for cobalt and lithium, they're just as much of a polluting or destruction of the Earth's resources. So a little bit of a balanced perspective and trying to find real-world solutions rather than just pie-in-the-sky theories.
The pie in the skies. Steve, how many pies are you cooking on the microgrid?
Probably got a couple pies in the oven. Good morning, or good afternoon. My name's Steve Johans. I'm the founder and CEO of Rayon Global. And my background, 20 plus years, energy and infrastructure with some of the largest companies, Westinghouse, Eaton Corporation. Done a lot in the area of utility and traditional energy throughout my entire career. I've also had the benefit, and I've been blessed to work around some great innovators, people like Microsoft. I had an opportunity in my life to be involved in the Xbox launch way back when with contract manufacturers. I've worked around some of the best and brightest in the fintech space and the internet space. And I had a revelation about 2.5 years ago, and I was actually thinking more of kind of, I guess you consider it more the Musk mindset, which I think is kind of distorted right now. And so I agree with David in that regard. So much focus on renewables and developed markets where we've got natural gas and traditional types of energy systems are going to work just fine in helping us innovate and create distributed generation. But what I came to the realization is there's a great opportunity to really address this last 20% of the population that we haven't figured this out for yet. And I can't tell you how frustrated I get from my colleagues in the U.S., folks like in Silicon Valley and other places, and even this, people talking Bitcoin and all these types of things, when there's, 2 billion people in the world that we can't turn a light on. And I think that's the thing we got to start getting real with. And one of the most, where the revelation I had is, I got on an airplane kind of post-Ebola of Sierra Leone, and I flew there. And people say there's not a time machine. I said there is a time machine. It had American Airlines on the side of it, and I got in it. And I knew everything that I knew in the U.S. I knew all this innovation, technology, and solar and batteries and things. And I got in that time machine, and I went back 200 years. And I landed, and I got out. And one of the things that we've started to recognize in the explosion of Rayon and the interest we've got in the innovation that has happened is what we're realizing some of humanity's greatest opportunities and solutions lies in the hands of these women in the most rural parts of the world. And I've given talks called Hyper-Innovation Lies in the Hands of the Invisible Woman, and I believe it. The opportunity to create, carbon-free commerce, the opportunity to create connectivity, internet connectivity, solar power, electricity. And so this is what we've been doing. And we've been doing it now for the last couple of years. We made a significant acquisition in India where we're covering half the country. And now we're partnered with the Microsofts and the MasterCards and the Vodafones to bring this mission, this vision to life. And so we'll talk more about it. Caspar touched on the Watt coin, which is another kind of skunkworks operation within our organization. We've got some of the best and brightest in fintech. We do believe, like Caspar and his partner, believe. I think the Bitcoin blockchain is worse than anything we've probably seen in a generation in terms of the carbon impact it's having, the centralization, the promotion of bad things in the world, the bad actors that use it and are propping it up. And I think, as a group, we're sitting here in Davos, some of the best and brightest, the wealthiest, some of the greatest leaders in the world and in companies, and some of them sitting right in this room, that we've got to start rolling up the sleeves and doing the hard work and focusing on those last 20%, and that'll be our salvation in terms of our ability to do that, not look the other way like we've done for the last 150 years. So that's Rayon Global. We'll talk more about getting into some of the details in terms of what that means, how we're doing it, and how I think it could change the world.
Thank you so much, Steve. Now it gets exciting. Reza, you're on the cloud. You see the world from above. You travel with the cloud across the globe, and you see a lot of interesting things. Reza prepared an interesting presentation. It's not just a presentation, it's actually his life. It is his life's work from the various inputs that goes into it to assess how people use energy, how they move around, and how we can make things better. It is extremely complex. It is extremely complex. Reza is an absolute leader in his field of the energy transformation, not only from an academic standpoint, but also from an entrepreneurial standpoint. Very engaged across industrial landscape, including the ABBs and so afterwards. Please, Reza.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. If you don't mind, I'll stand up. About 10 years ago, I'm sitting in a board of a company. I'm on a board of a publicly traded company where the CEO gets up and talks about an investment in infrastructure. I ask a question, how do you know? The numbers that you put up. Where do you get it from? He said, well, everybody knows that. So I said, how do they know? And then you go back and you look and you look and you look, and you realize the numbers we throw around is not exactly facts, as we all know. So about 10 years ago, I said, well, why don't we try to figure it out a little better? And at the end, it comes down to how do we insert technology, which often means enabling investment. Investment means risk management. So I have something called risk management gone digital. And I will tell you a little bit about what we do. This is the number of planes that are traveling across the world. This is the total number of planes that are moving at any instant. You see a day and night. Massive amount of movement, but in a very narrow band. These are the number of ships that are traveling around the world. You see some hotspots around the world in the Sea of China, in the English Channel, or the North Sea, and you see these hotspots of movement of material. This is immigration around the world. Number of people that are immigrating from different parts to different parts of the world. Movement of people has a fundamental impact on everything around us. So the question was, in this complex, diverse world, how do we add things up? How do we add up in any way? Well, if you look at phenomena, urbanization, jobs and mobility and investment, population, aging population, you've got to figure out where people are. We talk about the need, but need where and how much? Immigration and investment, global markets and sovereign law. What is global? What is sovereign? How do they change? Geopolitical competition, trade investment, societal transformation, digitalization, a technology insertion. How do we bring new technology into our society? What's the impact? And the role of climate change. This is people moving and urbanization. If somebody asks me what is the biggest driver of all of that, I would say urbanization. And I've looked at all of these. Urbanization is a #1 driver. Climate change will also move with massive movement of people. You have to take that into account. In Switzerland alone, I've been here 18 years, the population has gone up 15%, all due to immigration. The energy infrastructure also has to transform. Transform to match this change of people and the demand in the coming years. And the question is how? How do we add up? Well, it turns out it's all interconnected. And it's very difficult to separate it. So what we decided to do is not to separate it, but actually leave it connected and create a digital map of the world. I'll show you part of that. This looks at immigration within Switzerland alone. Interesting. If you look at this group, 60% of immigrants into Switzerland are between the age 20 and 39. A 20 and a 30-year-old will have a totally different demands in future than an 80-year-old or a 15-year-old. So you have to take that into account as it evolves. So there's also a role of time. Today, everything is done through set a plan, observe, change. So he said, why don't we create a scenario-based model of the world that accounts for everything? And that's what we do. We have massive amount of data. We use satellite image processing, we scrape the web, all public information, categorized into every element of society, every building, every person, every car, everything, power plants. We model the industries. We model role of policy, role of money. Then we create algorithms that looks at how could they change based on scenarios that are political decisions of future. And then we run long-term scenarios and then come back and present it to people to understand what are we showing. We run 30-year scenarios, hourly level. We run every hour of every day for the next 30 years. That's about 20,000 time steps. We look at people, buildings, cars, energy, economy, pension funds, social security, jobs, industry. And then we look at the effect of change due to policy. We have North America, all of continental Europe, Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. These are every power plant in Europe, 33,000 of them. Every types. We run them hourly. We simulate how they behave. This is every grid, the total grid of Europe, about 300,000 kilometers, both at the transmission and distribution level. This is the demand, people, industry, services. We run it hourly, including the time, the seasonal change. And then we ask ourselves, gas pipeline. Including present and future, we extend ourselves into Russia. Also, we model the LNG fleet of the world. Then the question is, can we achieve the goals we set economically? One was the 45% renewable energy for Europe. What is the impact would be on gas demand? What would be the impact on CO2 pricing? Well, what we found out was that yes, the answer is we can achieve it economically, and we need about 600 billion in renewable investment in Europe over the next 15 years. Not that much, can be done. Role of CO2. It turns out it causes, because we run trade, a model we account for trading. We run 15-minute trading of electricity. We basically saw that the effect of CO2 pricing means that the transition between coal and gas will be accelerated, but the oil will start decaying. So that the demand would be going down, but the gas would go up, demand of coal, but not eliminated. Well, there was supposed to be another thing there, but that's finished. But just to wrap up, the digital world today, the amount of data and scenarios allows us to not rely on aggregate politically generated numbers, but go down to an individual, all the way from a small community to a continent, to look at the impact of policy and economy overall for all of us. So this is something that we work on. It's a work in progress. Caspar asked me to talk about it, so here it is. I'll be happy to answer a question. Oh, just one thing. You talked about cars. Yes. We ran a simulation. We switched, because we modeled all the traffic in Europe. We ran a simulation. We converted all the cars immediately from gasoline to electric overnight, instantaneously, and the emission went up.
What can I say? So you eliminated all the gasoline-driven cars overnight. You put everything on Tesla, and the emission went up.
Yes.
Now that is quite, and this is no joke.
No.
No. Okay.
We actually published a journal paper on that. The total emission went up because of the way the electricity market works today. A lot of lignite plants of Germany in Europe. We did that in Europe.
In Europe, yeah.
All the lignite plants of Germany and Poland come online, and the emission, both in terms of CO2 and sulfur, went up.
Maybe that is probably a very short-term replacement energy situation. So you have to take what you have. So
we looked at it also.
Maybe quickly, what means lignite for the people on it here?
It's basically low energy. It's kind of like a coal. But lower energy. What we saw is that if Europe continues with a policy, in about 15 years or so, it switches. Then the emission will go down, which helps us in terms of setting a role of policy in how much technology should be inserted when. When.
So you develop a framework to shape policy strategies, which are based on a gradual transformation instead of the jerky tactical moves. Correct. That could lead into the into opposing side of energy misuse. Thank you so much for the first round. Okay, we are all collectively very, very stupid. We own houses that we don't live in, or use only fragmentally. We drive huge cars that spend most of the time in the garage, and we mostly drive as lonely souls across congested streets. We manufacture stuff that the moment that we buy, throw away. Well, digital technology holds the promise to reduce that inefficiency across many different sectors. Energy is the single nexus between life, manufacturing, and transport. How can digital technology reduce our collective stupidity of energy and mobility inefficiency? Maybe I would like to start with Steve.
Thank you. So Casper's actually absolutely right. Collectively, we are very stupid, all right, as a collective, and not by our own demise. I mean, if you understand, I mean, the way that our energy infrastructure is constructed, you know, it started 130 some years ago with a few, you know, guys in the Northeast United States, guys like Westinghouse and Edison and Tesla and J.P. Morgan as the financier. So our energy systems are constructed today, our world is organized around carbon-emitting fuels today simply by a business model and the technology we had available at the time to get things going. All right, so that's just a fact. And so, you know, it's not surprising that a small percentage of the population, primarily, you know, white males in the world, are at the top of the food chain in the energy side of the industry. So it's just built, it's constructed that way. So the thing that we've challenged people with to think about the future of energy is to think that first we had to do that, then we had to, that gave us the opportunity with electricity, we got telecommunications, we got computers, we got the internet, we got mobile communication, we got all these things. Now we've got blockchain. So the idea is, how could we start over, taking all that innovation technology and then going to the least of us and starting from that end of the value chain? And I think what you'll find, and we've found it, all of our engineers and a lot of the people that work on this and a lot of the people I speak to around the world, is that that business model and that building up from the bottom up really is an eye-opener to what the future of smart cities will look like, what the future of urbanization will look like. I mean, any serious smart city initiative or proposal I've ever seen, what does it look like? It looks like more localized, you know, sharing type of economies, walking distance, sustainable communities. If you just peel it back, you are looking at rural villages. You are looking at a new version of a rural village. That's what any smart urbanization project looks like anywhere in the world, any good one. And so the point I've always made is, you know, while we're all focused on ourselves in developed economies, why not take the opportunity to do it from in the actual villages themselves? Why not go there and learn, invest, bring them up with us, and in doing that, we'll learn what our smart cities should look like. We'll build them up from the ground up.
To bottom up instead of top down.
Because you're not going to be able to. I got bad news for a lot of people who are investing a lot of money, and at least in a lot of this, you know, this infrastructure. It's effectively dead money in many respects because, you know, you can't just, you know, switch this, you know, infrastructure around. You know.
So, Joe, you mentioned dead money, bottom up. Rehan, you're the investor. You have the money. Where would you put the money that it doesn't die? Where do you put the money that it doesn't die and relieves us from our own stupidity of energy and mobility misuse?
Yeah. Caspar, perhaps is it at all possible for me to make some contradictory statements with the professor and then actually agree with him on a certain aspect?
A contrary statement is not allowed in a liberal society. Please welcome to do so.
So
I urge you.
Yeah, the
please.
switch from an internal combustion engine to an electrical vehicle is dependent on the fuel source within a country. So if we, let's just say, take a country like France, which has high reliance on nuclear power, the emissions actually drop quite significantly. If you take other countries within Europe that do have higher dependence on coal, it actually is at much more higher and not equivalent. But if we do look at, let's say, the United States over the past 5 years has had significant investments in natural gas and utility-scale renewables. So if you look at the CO2 emissions, they're actually declining there, so the switch in the US will be accordingly. China right now, you don't get the advantage, but there's significant amounts in utility-scale renewables there as well. But there's actually a severe problem of centralized generation of electricity is that from generation, production, transportation to the end user, 60% of the energy or greater is lost. So that's why when you add more centralized energy, it actually is is one of the most inefficient technologies out there at the moment.
The centralization of energy is inefficient, you say?
Highly inefficient.
Highly inefficient. Reza, would you agree with that?
No, that's incorrect.
Nothing correct.
The conversion of PV, on average, you are looking at about 10 to 20%.
Please, what is PV? Private venture vehicles or the private vehicles? That's my car.
Photovoltaic piece.
Solar power.
Yes. If you look at the gas turbine combined cycle, it's about 65%. You lose about, depending on where you live, in Europe it's about 6% loss of the power. If you convert to the small scale, the efficiencies are actually go down.
So you mean, okay, so but the energy you put in, the energy you get out in the photovoltaic, so in the solar power is less efficient than the one from...
Well, the fuel source is different because the sun has, is a radiative source. But in terms of pure efficiency, the numbers that were mentioned, the centralized is the most efficient in terms of efficiency. Not necessarily capital efficiency, but in terms of the technical efficiency is the most reliable and efficient way of doing it. But it's not the solution for everywhere.
So it really depends on a regional aspect.
Well, it depends. For example, if you take a country like South Africa, South Africa has two population sources, one in Cape Town, one in Joburg. And there's about 1,700 kilometers that they run cables for coal power plant. That is highly inefficient and it's very polluting. South Africa's policy needs to change to create effectively a bifurcated government policy. However, when you look at the continental Europe, where all the countries are interconnected, that's what you have to understand. There is no country of France or Italy. They're all interconnected and they're connected through a trading mechanism that allows electricity to be exchanged. So we look at the whole of Europe, not a specific country.
I would agree that Europe is probably among the most efficient compared to the emerging markets, and the US is actually much less efficient than Europe. But in terms of the development, we are seeing some significant changes bottom up. Akon, the famous musician, is actually a very astute business person. And currently, right now, he's covered 22 countries within Africa, and his objective is to cover all 68 nations within Africa to go more towards distributed generation, localized power to bring electrification there. So the solutions that Steve was mentioning are actually being implemented very rapidly, and the effects will be revolutionary in nature. Because if you do look at the world map at nighttime, where it's darkest is actually where you have the most sunlight during the daytime. It's also the area where you have the largest differential between male and female education. The only proven statistically significant driver of pro forma GDP growth rates is the delta in female education. There are many drivers of GDP growth rates, but that is statistically significant. So as people like Akon and Steve start to electrify on a microgrid level throughout the Sun Belt, we're going to see a significant rise in GDP in these areas, which will demand even more energy. So
let's teach the girls better.
That's the future, yes.
For happy growth. How can we become less stupid in our efficiency, David?
One of the things I think that's interesting, Steve's point is right, that we've got areas of the world where we can take these very modern technologies and implement them because we're literally dealing with greenfields. And that makes absolutely...
Greenfields maybe, sorry?
Well, I'm saying a greenfield project is obviously slang for somewhere that's previously unutilized. But in this case, we're literally talking about greenfields in rural areas in Africa.
To build a new plant on the spot, not use an existing.
Well, to build out infrastructure, housing, microgrids, etc., because you're starting from scratch. But I think, going back to my sort of opening statement, is that it's ridiculous to try and do that everywhere, because this so-called stupid infrastructure is actually incredibly efficient. What was not efficient was some of the end users of this infrastructure. So, for example, the internal combustion engine. I mean, first it was invented, then everyone was so excited, they just wanted to see how fast it could go. And then after that, they realized it was pretty dangerous that it went that fast and you didn't wear a seatbelt. So we spent the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s putting in ABS and roll bars and seatbelts, and everyone thought that was pretty amazing. And then we got sat-nav and comfier chairs and air conditioning. And it's actually only in the last 20 years that people have said, oh gosh, we should probably take care of our environment. So We just made the car better and more fun, but we didn't worry about any implications. With the engineers turning their minds to improving the efficiency of the internal car, you have Nissan and Toyota producing cars which have a much lower footprint than a Tesla. So should we go towards electric cars? Yes, as part of the solution. But the fact is we should be doing innovation everywhere. So we should be innovating using modern technologies from the bottom up, as Steve said, but we should be looking to grind inefficiencies at every part of the value chain, because it would be ridiculous to just move away from the billions and trillions of dollars that were set up for pipelines and other transportation networks during the 20s and 30s. So the overall approach from a policy perspective has got to be more mature, less headline seeking, and actually look to use every part of our value chain, which includes oil, it includes electricity, it includes computing power, it includes everything. And so that's being then less stupid.
How do you apply, you mentioned something, so to grind the inefficiency across the entire value chain. The value chains, in a very simple kind of structure, you could look up, mid, downstream, and especially in commodity, that's quite simple to portray. You are in that industry, in the commodity industry. You look at up, mid, downstream. You are predominantly active in the midstream, but also the up midstream.
Yeah, well, I mean, everyone has a kind of different cutoff point there, but the point you raised there about, our product, methanol, which is historically was used to make building products and plastics and paints. But over the last few years, and especially in China, it's become part of the energy economy, and 25% of methanol goes directly into competing with oil, but actually in transportation fuels. And on one side, that seems like it's not moving away from the old-fashioned economy. But in actual fact, when you look at the United States, which has abundant natural gas, by producing much more methanol and blending methanol into the fuel pool instead of ethanol, you would be lowering carbon emissions. What is the difference between ethanol and methanol? There's so many ol and e and m. Well, they're both alcohols. Ethanol is probably the one you like to drink.
I'm not married yet, but
and methanol is essentially, it's formerly called wood alcohol, but is essentially manufactured from industrial processes.
How many C's do you have in ethanol, methanol, propanol, butanol?
Methanol only has one carbon, and ethanol has two, which is why it burns more efficiently, because it burns completely cleanly with a blue flame and converts straight to, unfortunately, CO2 and water, but much less CO2 than gasoline. And so, again, as I said, maybe it's not the future for 50 years from now, but it should be part of the thinking for the next 10 years.
Next 10 years. Reza, how can you mentioned, so we have two opposing views. Centralization, decentralization brings more efficiency. Who is more stupid, who is less stupid? What can we do in order to reduce our collective stupidity?
I think we have to be careful on how we define efficiency. If you look at capital efficiency, it's one thing. If you look at technically what is physically efficient, that's another. When you're in sub-Saharan Africa, if you want to build a grid power line and you have to pay 15% margin risk, country risk, building up an entire grid structure is economically unfeasible and economically inefficient because the risk premium is so high. In that country, a distributed, a microgrid solution that co-locates effectively the user and supplier together absolutely makes sense. Or if you're in the middle of New York City or Zurich and your substation cannot add any more power, you want to upgrade your hospital, and there's no way, the cost of upgrading that substation is just too much. Economically, it's inefficient. There you also go for a microgrid solution. However, in a country like Germany or Switzerland, with a risk premium of about 0.25% to 0.5%, it absolutely does not make sense on a national level to get rid of the existing infrastructure, because it's the most both technically and economically efficient way to go.
If you look at, when we were looking at when I was watching the presentation there too, one of the things you got to really take into consideration when we talk efficiency, if you look at refugee movement, if you look at where people move to, guess what they do? They go from places where they have nothing to places where people have something. So this idea of getting electricity in these last 2 billion people, it's critical on every single measured level. On keeping people into their communities, so movement of refugees. It's critical for health. Kerosene will kill 2 million people just this year, every year. It'll kill 2 million people a year in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Ingestion, black lung, fires. It puts 250 million tons of black carbon, the worst kind of carbon you can put into the atmosphere every year. Health and education. So one of the things, and it's encouraging just in the last 5 years, but people talk about value chains, but I have news for you. The value chain actually never, in the last 5 years, people are talking about the value chain getting to the end. The value chain, as far as I've talked to people, 5, 6, 7 years ago, stopped in developing markets for the most part. They didn't even talk, there was no value down that chain. And so I think one of the encouraging things is people are really starting to see that value. The other really interesting thing on digitization to understand, because we're talking to some really big companies around this, is the future that could be shown to us too in these rural villages is who actually pays for electricity. Where's the value for that? And what I mean by that is, you talk to companies like Unilever, they're head of, global, the senior vice president, head of global sustainability. Guess what? They might be interested in picking up that 50 cents a day or 30 cents a day to turn the lights and fans on. And why? Because they want to create a new consumer. They want to hatch one. And they want to get them connected. And they want to do it in a clean, sustainable way. It meets their goals in terms of sustainability and other things. So the other interesting thing I think you're going to see with digitization, things like blockchain, and other ways to do it more innovatively, is it could be that the electricity is the commercially subsidized thing for these rural villagers. Much like we get radio and television and internet, we are commercially subsidized. So that's another interesting way to look at it. And the last thing I'll just quickly mention, just to open your thoughts a little bit, but it could be that because these rural villagers, to Rayhan's point, are sitting underneath the best sunlight in the world, what if they are the world's solar farmers? And what if we can allow them, as they use more renewable energy and consume it, we can digitize that asset? And what if we can move that asset onto somebody's balance sheet that is a carbon emitter voluntarily, and they could reward that person, that villager, for the ability to move that to their balance sheet?
So you shift, we talked about big numbers, $100 trillion required over the next 20 to 30 years in order to accommodate the electrification of the world and adhere to the COP21 agreement. So that could lead not only from Rayhan's direction, from top-down investment side into big long-term assets, but only a bottom-up, utilizing the microgrids as a means to create digital assets, or the flow to create digital assets, to empower the individual owners of these micro plants to become the financiers of parts of the microgrid. So not only is it coming from top down, but also bottom up. It's quite, Rayon, you listen.
Yeah, Caspar, I do think the most inefficient part of the energy landscape is not as much in the upstream generation, downstream, but it's actually the way we consume electricity at the moment. If we look at automobiles, 95% of the time we own a car, it's actually parked. So if we go towards a more shared economy, the way we have towards housing, let's say through Airbnb, or in that direction, we can save significant amounts of money and be far more efficient. If we look at traffic congestion around the world, 20 of the top 25 most congested cities are in the emerging markets. On their estimates that it wastes 2 to 4% of global GDP per annum due to traffic congestion. And if you take, for example, a solely driven internal combustion engine right now, on average in the United States, would cost about $2.50 per mile. Now, if we take or a taxi, so including the driver, if we take an autonomous EV vehicle that's self-driven, that will drop down to 17 cents. And some of these revolutions would perhaps take place in the emerging markets. The emerging markets may leapfrog the developed markets. Half of all electric vehicles right now are being produced in China. So China produces as much as the rest of the world. And there are strong advances in China towards autonomous driving. They're already testing with trucks driving across specific lanes. So I think the way we're actually utilizing energy at the end area is the most efficient part of the area, and that has to change. And it is changing because of technology.
What is you smiling? You agreeing?
Well,
That's a long well, partially.
In our models, we do demand response. That effectively, instead of having the usage as people have it, we have a centralized demand control. And we found about a 5% improvement. The total mobility, the cars, represent about 15% increase. If you switch everything to electricity, the total grid demand goes up by 15%, not factors of 2 or 3. But you know, it really comes down to think of it in terms of transformation of our society and our infrastructure around us. And there's one thing in there that I would agree with you. The key to it is pension funds.
Pension fund.
Investment by pension funds. Pension funds don't know how to allocate their money, so they put it in buckets that they have. Pension funds represent, I mean, today in OECD is about close to $60 trillion. And this is all goes primarily into stock market and, you know, not necessarily infrastructure. Yes.
Liquid assets.
Liquid
the
assets.
problem is, how do we match a tenure of 20 years, that's average exposure of an infrastructure, even more sometimes, with average lifespan of a pension fund requirements, which is also about 20 years.
Which matches perfectly.
Which matches perfectly, but why don't they match, Rayon?
Because of the...
sorry, no, please, Reza, yeah, please.
Mismatch of individual interests of the asset managers within pension funds are not measured on 20 years. If I'm an asset manager and I put it in infrastructure and I lose 1 year, I would be in trouble. As long as I follow everybody else, I'm okay. So it's really a dialogue among investment community to say this is a class of investments that require a greater allocation.
It's the human issue versus the actual economic issue, where incentives for a manager who's the head of a large pension fund is measured over a 3 to 5 year period, and the managers he has maybe even on a shorter period. Versus
I would add even more to that. I think it's not only the human aspect, which is really dependent on the employer. You know, how your reward system is. Yeah. Because on a bigger issue, I had a substantial discussion in this regard with IMF and World Bank, also in collaboration with the Swiss National Bank, in order to find better ways to match this 20-year tenure. And one big issue was also the technical expertise required in order to match, you know, the private equity aspects, particularly in emerging markets, in high growth markets, how to invest into these projects, how to meet those demands. And pensions are slowly catching up with a lot of help and interaction with the World Bank in this aspect. One of the largest, actually, in a percentage-wise, as invest in infrastructure as pension funds is OMERS, where David Beatty is on the board in Canada. They allocate up to 10%. OMERS is one of the largest pension fund systems in Canada, and one of our mutual friends, he's on the board. Yep. And they invest up to 10%. They have a dedicated team in-house and collaborate out-house with a joint venture of a private equity company in order to allocate the capital. That might be a solution to build a bridge to this chasm.
By the way, one thing I want to just offer up, you know, from the villager perspective, which I bring in, is you know, some of the best credit risk right now in the world is a rural village woman. Okay, I mean, there's some of the best people to lend money to right now in the world. They pay back. Not only do they pay back, they make sure their friends pay back too. All right, so you know, there's opportunities to, you know, we're doing a really innovative new credit facility in India. It's an initial $50 million credit facility, but we're going to do 100% financing to a rural villager that's never had credit, you know, micro lend. You say, well, how can you do that? Well, this is where innovation and policy and digitization, you know, India's got a phenomenal program called Aadhaar that's taken off for the last 5 years. They have over 1.1 billion people that have identification with biometrics. Why is that important? Now you can use simple innovation like a Samsung phone, do a biometric read with our financier partner. You can identify, qualify, approve them. Money can get wired up, come over to our account. We can pull that system out of inventory. That whole transaction can take less than 5 minutes. So this idea of financing, I mean, there's the big stuff we talk pension funds, but there's so much digital innovation opportunity at the finance level through ID, identification, these types of systems, that you just keep in mind the revolution of the cell phone. In 2000, there was less than 5% of sub-Saharan Africa had access to a phone.
Yeah.
Today, you're almost 85%. So you have to think, could we do electricity systems that fast? And the answer is, yeah, it could happen that fast if you use similar business models.
It could happen. One last comment, and then we open the floor.
Kaspar, I think many of the solutions for financing within the emerging markets will be indigenous in nature. If we do look at it, let's say as an outside pension fund, if we want to invest in country X, we want a 15-16% rate of return. We want a MEGA wrapper. We want a guarantee, a sovereign guarantee to come in there, given the risks involved there. One of the largest investors within the emerging markets actually does tend to be China. So China, actually, their cost of capital tends to be a lot lower. They do want to get the EPC contracts. They do finance a lot lower. So China is actually one of the, although right now does have very high carbon output as a nation, is actually a driver of the green revolution. Part of that, too, is massive Chinese capacity coming on in solar panels, and they're dominating that. So they're slamming down the price to make renewable energy much cheaper. Additionally, China is dominating batteries as well. So, a company like BYD and the largest Chinese EV producer is actually produces more cars than Tesla. So the revolution is actually within emerging markets going to emerging markets, number one. Number two, if we look at emerging markets, as they put on a lot more indigenous sources of fuel, solar, hydro, geothermal, within their countries, they're importing less oil. As less currency goes out, interest rates start to come down, savings rise, and you have a lot more capital within the country to actually allocate capital. And if you look at the emerging markets right now, the average debt to GDP is half that of the developed world.
Which is rising, though, very fast.
Yep. It is rising fast, but also if they are investing less oil coming into their countries, interest rates will decline, and their cost of capital will decline indigenously. Also, it's at a micro level, as Steve was mentioning. We're looking at the expansion of cell phones, digitization, and paying power through your cell phone. And in the emerging markets, a lot of cell phone payments are prepaid. And that's the model that folks like Aecon and the people who are very aggressively involved in the emerging markets are providing emerging market solutions that are actually leapfrogging our own solutions.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, the panel. I would like to open the floor for a couple of questions. Please. Yes. Maybe your name and, oh yeah, here you have a microphone. And the question is with a question mark at the end.
Yes. Vahini Telkapali, I have a question for Professor Reza. What do you see a future for carbon capture and storage technology in Europe?
No.
You don't. So it's it's dead.
No, it's very simple. Carbon, when you capture it, you've got to put it somewhere. It turns out that carbon is actually CO2 is a very dangerous thing because it displaces air and you can suffocate. So trying to site a CO2 site in a densely populated place like Europe is, frankly, I cannot imagine any community allowing that to happen. That means going offshore, which you may end up killing a lot of fish, but again, the infrastructure to do that, when you compare it to alternatives, does not make economic sense. So I do not see carbon capture for Europe.
No carbon capture for Europe. What could we capture as the next questions? Yes, please.
Actually, I thought actually that the biggest consumption of petrol is actually in shipping. So wouldn't there be the biggest saving factor? So wouldn't there be the biggest saving factor if shipping is one of the biggest or the biggest consumption of petroleum? If you would reallocate production to the places where the use is, because that's easy, machinery and whatever, and actually even salaries are not so much an impact anymore. You can produce some stuff in Switzerland even at similar cost like in China nowadays. Because then you don't ship like commodities from Africa to China.
The question is, question mark. The question is.
Do people think about that actually maybe reallocation of fabrication to where the use is would use usually one way of commodities? Just, it's maybe by half.
Caspar, is Morten in the crowd? Right? He's an expert within shipping.
No, he's not here. But I can help him. I can help you out. But please.
No, well, the shipping is already, the new regulations are making them much more efficient. So transportation fuel demand is roughly about 40%. So you add in air, shipping combined, close to 50% goes towards transportation fuels. So getting the efficiencies there is going to be key.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, so things that you're not going to turn electric overnight are airplanes that fly in the air and ships. Okay, so those are going to be always, but there are ways to use the system to incentivize others to use clean energy, and this whole idea of digitization can. So as an example, Microsoft, they have a kind of a fee that they get for their employees, for when they fly airplanes, so that they can then go out and take that money and go buy voluntary carbon offsets to offset that fuel. So that's a way that they're trying to drive to carbon neutral by having people use more clean energy to offset the fact they're flying a lot of airplanes, their employees are. So, we're looking at very innovative strategies like that in transportation through this kind of digitization approach, through, like, for instance, blockchain, where you can move, so if you're a shipper or a airline, you're going to have to use fuel. You're going to have to use carbon. But there's nothing saying every mile that plane flies, you couldn't purchase voluntary carbon offsets to offset it that made more clean energy get consumed and used.
And there are also a lot of the innovations coming through. There are the innovations to put solar panels on top of the car or roof cars. So you're generating electricity even while you're driving. And they're also on ships as well. But there is innovation on CO2 capture. If you look at the SK Group in Korea, they have some of the most advanced technology in the world. Right now, it is not economically viable, but they've actually developed a technology where you capture CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it into plastic bottles.
Okay. One more. Yes, please.
Thank you. Two very quick questions on microgrids. First, how do you measure peaks and also time when it's too much produced? And second, in Switzerland, we have also rural villages. Typically, it's high above Davos, for example, where these wooden houses used to use for summer are located without no grid, no transportation. What would you offer? Thank you.
No, thank you. So,
Steve is a popular partner.
Yeah, having been in the business industry for a long time in the microgrids, one of the big challenges, traditional ways of thinking microgrids off the utility, is you're putting a lot of CapEx cost infrastructure to build it when you don't know how people are going to use it yet because they haven't had electricity before or how they're going to pay for it. It's been one of the big challenges why you haven't seen microgrid scale. And so one of the things we recognize is if you start at the absolute end of the line with these kind of innovative systems, a lot of things are happening in that little box. One is you're starting to see how people are consuming energy for the first time. They're creating credit history. And ultimately, then you can securitize that data, securitize that information, and then you can build...
What means securitize something? It's a very American term, and for the ones not in finance...
So if I get a bunch of people using these solar home systems, and they're paying us on a regular basis to use those, they're creating credit history with us. And so we can go to places like the World Bank or other funders or Rayon and his pension funds and say, here we've got 50,000 people in this village paying us on a regular basis, prepaying us actually, and we're seeing how they're consuming electricity. And then we can engineer larger scale mini grids and microgrids. And ultimately what you see happen is these little boxes that are turning LED lights and radios and fans on will end up becoming smart meters, and then we'll plug them into the microgrid in this kind of transactive, kind of network. But it'll be a very robust, resilient microgrid because you're engineering it from the ground up.
So for the first time in history, the small wooden house in the Swiss Alps will have actually electricity. That's quite amazing. I grew up like this, by the way, so I understand it quite well. Even the toilet outside of the house. Yes. No flushing toilets. In winter, it's all iced up. Not very funny. Yeah. No heating inside. You have to put the wood in the stove. Reza.
I just want to say something about energy. Energy is a big thing. You're not going to have one solution for everything. It's about transformation. We work with, for example, City of St. Gallen. How do you integrate microgrid to countries? How do you come up with policy? Or multinational, how do you move assets around? Fundamentally, it's about transformation to account for climate change, movement of people, immigration, and really competition globally. And the driver for that is upfront payment, which is the capital allocation. Where digitalization comes in is how I started at the beginning. I said, I was sitting in a board. I said, where did we get these numbers? I didn't trust the numbers that were presented because they were aggregate political. Digitalization allows us to improve risk management, which would then allows us for pension funds to get more involved.
To customize really and drill down to the very essence of data.
Exactly.
And make sense on depending whoever supply-demand requirements.
Correct.
I mean, that's probably a big aspect also is you, David, as an investor and entrepreneur. You cannot rely on this aggregate data. You have to go down to the very details, to extreme details, in fact, because you allocate capital in 20-year horizon spans. And you are exposed to huge risks. Actually, this huge risk, not only capital risk, also political risks, environmental risks, market risks, operational risks, and you sit there fully vested, and you have to manage all those risks as going along. So you cannot rely on this general, I think we tend to aggregate numbers together. I mentioned these big numbers for that exactly purpose. It sounds big, but when it comes down, it grinds down to the very essential minute details of the local particularities and where we stand in an economic cycle, in society cycle, and so on. Extremely complex. Energy is the single most complex industry we have in the world, I would say, I dare to say. So far, I have not found a more complex industry. It's only also the industry which leads country into political conflicts or out of political conflicts if you structure the right policies. We have to be extremely careful how you address this transformation from carbon to non-carbon, and also urbanization processes, from the mobility aspects and so on. I try to summarize what we have learned today. Can digital technology accelerate the energy transformation? Question mark. David, stupid infrastructure is highly efficient. Innovation is everything. Grind inefficiency across all value chains. Then from Rayon, let's educate the girls for higher energy efficiency in the future. Reza, we are all globally interconnected, but efficient energy utilization depends on the local particularities. And from Stephen, I have a revelation. It looks like a little bit like to somebody who has a revelation, a copy-paste from me, but let's do more skunk work projects and empower those invisible women by carbon-free commerce. Thank you so much, all the panel, for this fantastic panel about energy.
We would like to thank Kaspar, or officially I will tell Dr. Kaspar Benziger, for this great job done, for the 7 months of 24/7 tough, hard work, and for this really exceptional event which he produced. Thank you very much.